Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. I hope everyone had a good lunch, but not so good that you're going to fall asleep. Although I don't think that will happen. We have a wonderful lineup of panelists here this afternoon. So I do not think you have the risk of being even a little bit sleepy unless you had lots and lots of carbs. Welcome back to our afternoon presentation today. My name is Wahida Saif. I am the program coordinator with Riverside Trauma Center. We will be going into one of our two panels today. Our panel this afternoon, the panel you have chosen to participate in is Shaping Prevention Strategies Through Stories of Hope and Lived Experience. So if you have been with us from the beginning of the morning today and followed the clinical track, you have really delved into how suicide prevention has looked in the clinical field, really through the clinical lens, and really delved into some numbers and research. And we want to really delve into now stories of folks who are perhaps now on the other side of this or straddling both sides of this, the clinical world and the lived experience world. And we have now with us this afternoon three wonderful speakers, three different perspectives that I think will really bring to light the world of suicide prevention from different perspectives. And as we go forward, we want to really look at this lens and think about how can we take suicide prevention from our clinical offices into the world of putting it into practice and going into from what we have been doing into what we can be doing and what perhaps the world of suicide prevention is going to look going into the future. So I'm going to go ahead and read to you their bios ahead of time so I don't interrupt their storytelling. The first presenter is Dr. Pata Tsuyomoto. Dr. Pata Tsuyomoto is a feminist scholar, writer, educator, diversity trainer, mental health activist, jewelry designer, and an avid bicyclist. She earned her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, did her research at anti-research education and issues of race and racism. She is the co-chair for the Greater Boston Regional Suicide Prevention Coalition and the chair of Massachusetts Coalition for Suicide Prevention's Alliance for Equity's People of Color Caucus. Pata is one of the authors of Widening the Lens, exploring the role of social justice and suicide prevention, a racial equity toolkit. She has spoken and written about being a suicide attempt survivor, her struggles with chronic depression and complex PTSD. She is a co-founder of Breaking the Silence Project, which is an artistic endeavor that educates about the high rates of depression and suicide among Asian American young women. She's also a longtime volunteer for Asian Women for Health and is a trainer for the National Asian American Pacific Islander Mental Health Association's Achieving Whole Health program. She's active in the American Association of Suicidology's Impacted Family and Friends Division, the Attempt Survivors Lived Association of Suicidology's Impacted Family and Friends Division, the Attempt Survivors Lived Experience Division, and the Racial Equity and Inclusions Committee, and is currently an AAS board member. Her claim to fame is that she rode her bicycle across the country in the summer of 2012. Our second presenter is Isabel Garcia. She's a mental health, she has her MPH, is a first-generation Dominican immigrant and psychiatric survivor who experiences suicidal thoughts since childhood. I think that goes and ties in well with our last presenter if you were in the clinical track. She works to dismantle the myths and Satanism surrounding mental health and suicide in her community through public speaking engagements, social media outlets, and leadership roles. In 2020, Garcia founded Estoy Aquí, which is an LLC, an educational initiative that focuses on the social cultural factors contributing to suicide risk in Latino and Latinx and Black communities by providing social justice training, community care circles, culturally relevant outreach. Her most recent efforts include La Cultura Sana outreach projects, which provide dialogues and research on suicide prevention to key cultural figures in the Latinx, and Black communities, such as barbers and hairstylists, in an effort to reduce psychiatric and crisis hospitalizations in her community. And to finish out our round of panelists, we will have Shilpa Thiroko Valor. She joined the NAN project as a peer coordinator in March of 2020 after graduating from UMass Boston in 2019 with a double major in psychology and women's gender studies. As someone who deals with mental health challenges, Shilpa has experienced firsthand the cultural stigma that surrounds being open about mental health and understands the importance of having access to support. Being a part of the NAN Project's team has allowed her the opportunity to listen and learn from the lived experiences of other peer mentors. And she shares with the young adults what she wished she knew in high school about mental health, that it is okay to ask for help when you are struggling. So without too much more waiting, I'm going to go ahead and let Pata start off with her story.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. This is always the fun part, is getting the technology right. Let's see. I'm sorry. That'll do. Okay. Share. Okay, so I'm going to share my lived experience in the context of intergenerational mental illness and intergenerational racism. So first is the context. I grew up in a family who experienced intergenerational mental illness. My mother had bipolar disorder with psychotic features. My aunt on my father's side died by suicide, and my uncle and father dealt with major depression. My family history is riddled with severe mental illness. Personally, I have suffered with chronic depression and complex PTSD since I was 12 and in junior high school. At 16 years old, I tried to end my life, and I managed with the depression and PTSD without intensive treatment until my 30s. In my mid-30s, I had a severe episode which resulted in my dealing with complex PTSD and major depression for the past 25 years. People who haven't experienced major depression, complex PTSD, and suicidal ideation often have a difficult time understanding it. When you say you have major depression, people who don't have that diagnosis think they understand what you're experiencing because of the ways that depression is used in our language. Yet I submit that the experience of major depression and PTSD is not really understood by most folks who don't suffer from these conditions. So I want to give you a sense of what my mental illness has meant in my life. It means that I have a DSM diagnosis of major depression and PTSD. I have symptoms which include persistent sadness, lethargy, lack of concentration, agitation, nightmares, and suicidality. It means I have treatment-resistant depression. Excuse me. I have said I'm a chemistry experiment, and I've been on more psychiatric medications than most of you have medications in your cabinets. It means when my daughter was 5, I would take her to the park and watch her play and cry. It means that when my daughter was 8 years old and my ex-husband needed to move to Baltimore for work, we had to decide whose household would be better for her to live in. I was struggling at the time and made the hardest decision of my life to let her go live with her dad. And it still sort of chokes me up when I say that. It means that when I was finishing my dissertation, I spent an hour writing and an hour crying, no joke. It means that I lost my professional identity as a university professor as I could not sustain the work. And this picture is a painting my daughter did when she was 7 or 8 that I had in my office. It means in the past 20 years, I only read a handful of books as depression and trauma interfere with my concentration. It means that not a day goes by when I don't know, and when I wake up and I don't know what kind of day it will be, or whether I'll have a day or not. I routinely slog through and play hurt. This was a picture from the trip we went on, the cross-country bike trip. It means I spend an inordinate amount of time on psychotherapy, doctor's appointments, and necessary soul care. It means 10 years ago, when my best friend, who was also my ex-husband, was murdered, that the depression exacerbated the grief and the grief exacerbated the depression. It means that not a day goes by when I do not deal with my PTSD and depression. There are no breaks, there are no vacations from this. It means enduring depression is not for the faint of heart. Although each person's experience of depression and PTSD may have differences, I believe that many people who have these conditions would share some of these same experiences and emotions. And people of color have the added layer of dealing with racism and the cultural stigma in our own families and communities. In addition to the mental health issues, my family experienced historical trauma of my father being in an American concentration camp during World War II. My father was born in Sacramento, California in 1929. He lived in Berkeley until they were transported to Topaz, Utah in 1942. He was a junior in junior high school. It's impossible to know exactly how this experience affected my father and subsequently me and my sister. I do know that racism of the time worked to silence my father. I got a unique perspective on this when I attended a reunion of my father's junior high school class in camp. His classmates described my reclusive father as a vibrant leader who led a walkout when a teacher said a racist remark. He did this in the camps. My mind was blown. How could these stories be reconciled with the introverted, almost silent father that I knew? He chose to assimilate, albeit unsuccessfully. He moves his family to a white community on the East Coast with good schools. And growing up, there were only a few Asian families in the community, and even fewer Black or Latinx families. And when kids would call me Chink in elementary school, I would retort, if they were going to call me names, at least get it right. I'm a Jap. I always felt different and like an outsider, which reinforced by questions like, what are you? Which is a really impolite way of saying where are your ancestors from or what ethnicity are you? Or reactions like being surprised that I speak English so well. And unfortunately, I only speak English. I want to read a poem called My Story is Full of Lies that I wrote that sort of summarizes this experience. My story is full of lies. When I was 12, my diagnosis was major depression. At 16, I attempted suicide. At 35, my diagnosis includes dissociative disorder not otherwise specified. At 40, I took 19 pills to combat chronic and severe major depression and complex PTSD. Perhaps this is not surprising. Since my aunt died by suicide, my uncle faced serious depression, and my mother had bipolar disorder. One could say genetics is a cause of my mental illness. This is a lie. In 1942, when my dad were imprisoned in camp in Topaz, Utah, there's nothing there now but tumbleweeds, dried, hard ground, dust storms, and a plaque with an American flag on it. After camp, when my dad was in high school, a math teacher said he wouldn't amount to anything. My dad earned a PhD in mathematics. But trauma and racism silenced him. He became reclusive. I can only wonder what impact this has on me. And although I grew up solidly middle class, I also grew up in a white community where I was taunted and called chink and soy sauce. I was bullied in junior high. My mom was a crazy divorce lady. My sister's friend was forbidden from coming to our house. My mother also told me to not stand with my legs apart. It's not ladylike, she said. But closing my legs didn't stop my cousin from molesting me at 6, or at 16, a supervisor from groping me, not to mention the onslaught of catcalls and innuendos. A normal womanhood, one might say. This too is a lie. I grew to hate myself. What was there to love? After all, I was ridiculed for my race and attacked for my gender. When I came out as bisexual, that too was cause for pain. In high school, I hid this from my friends and my family. I hid this from the therapists in the hospitals they put me in. In my 20s, friends died of AIDS. They said it was our own fault, God's wrath. This too is a lie. No one ever said, perhaps your depression and PTSD are normal reactions to racism, sexism, homophobia, and hatred. Perhaps you are not sick. Perhaps your despair is not an illness. Perhaps this is my truth. So I want to talk a little bit about how culture and stigma has affected my experience. In American culture, we still live in a culture that stigmatizes and misunderstands mental illness. And you only need to look at the misinformation about celebrity suicides to know this is true. And in Asian American cultures, the stigma is often more extreme. There's a lot of silence and denial of mental health issues, and fear and shame. We're told we'll lose face if we admit depression or other mental illness, that we'll shame our families. And the message is that mental illness and suicidal ideation is a result of personal failure and not an illness or a result of environmental stressors such as poverty or racism. And in my life, my father had a hard time dealing with my depression. And when I told him I was suicidal when I was in my 30s, his body, he said nothing in his body. He had to turn away. He could not face that. And so the impact of the accumulated stigma from dominant culture, as well as the Asian American culture, combines to create a situation for Asian American people with mental illness. And the stigma made it so that I couldn't speak out. My truth. I couldn't speak my truth for fear of discrimination and misunderstanding. So things like, how are you, becomes a loaded question. What do you do? Even more so, particularly if you lost your job. Stigma means there's a risk in coming out as depressed, and this risk can range from emotional vulnerability to a loss of a job. And I've experienced the gamut. When I was teaching at the university about equity, I had a hard time coming out as a person with lived experience, whereas I knew if I had a physical ailment that I would have been completely open. I was pushed out of my position as a university professor. And I believe you need to be a warrior, a samurai warrior. In this case, it's a picture of a woman samurai warrior. And my grandmother always said we were descendants of samurai, so which I don't know is true or not, but I appreciate that energy. The other thing that affects Asian Americans in particular is the model minority myth. It adds to the stigma. And the myth says that Asian Americans are the model minority and that we are successful in academics and business and therefore do not have issues related to the minority status. And this is particularly harmful when applied to mental health. The burden of mental illness is exacerbated by the racism stereotypes of the model minority myth. Furthermore, culture and its impacts are not often addressed in mainstream psychology, which remains primarily a white field. And this is played out in my experience in a number of ways. One of the things that's been very important to me and has made meaning for my life is being a good enough mom. And my mother, who had bipolar disorder, did not talk about her illness. She didn't accept her illness. She didn't accept treatment for her illness. So she ended up hiding and denying her illness a lot. And I decided when I was diagnosed and when I was struggling that I would tell my daughter, be honest with her with no secrets, because secrets only create pain. In this picture, there's a clown, and this is where she was trying to cheer me up. And I explained to her that I really appreciated her efforts, but it wasn't her responsibility to cheer me up, that I had helpers that would help me give me support. And getting support was really important, and it takes a village, it really does. And when you are struggling with mental illness, it's particularly even more important. And it was very important to me that she knew that my mental illness was not her fault, because kids think everything's their fault, divorce, whatever. And, I was very clear when she was 3 or so, mommy has an illness that makes her sad, but it's not your fault, just not your fault. So that was really important to me. And working on that through my treatment plan was really key to my wellness. This is my treatment plan. I'm reclaiming treatment plan. Usually it's a top-down doctor. Doctors tell patients what to do. I think that all of us need to be empowered to say, this is my treatment plan, and includes all these things, including soul care activities, such as, writing and poetry and, those kinds of things, as well as the other more traditional and integrative approaches. And activism too is part of my treatment plan. I see that as a way I have worked to recover. And I started with Families for Depression Awareness, doing media. I was featured in I think it was a 2009 article on depression and Psychology Today, which was really coming out for me, because I came out And I had this person on the street say, I saw you in psychology today. I was like, oh no, what do they think? But anyway, we started the Breaking Silences Project, as mentioned in the intro. I work in the Asian American community, and I also work at the Massachusetts Coalition for Suicide Prevention Alliance for Equity. And we created a toolkit, which I will put in the chat once I stop speaking, for racial equity, for organizations who want to move toward racial equity and social justice. So finally, I believe that if we are invested in suicide prevention, we must be invested in shifting the narrative around suicide and fighting for racial equity on all levels of our work in society. I don't think I can stress enough the importance of beginning, as this work is imperfect and we can't let our fears of making mistakes stop us from starting. Although this process can be slow and frustrating, it's important to persist, and progress can be made even if it's almost imperceptible, like growth under the snow in February that results in growth in March when spring comes. This progress can accumulate and result in leaps forward later. We must remember that this work must be done on all levels: personal, cultural, institutional, and systemic, and at every level of any organization. It's critical that we all work on our own blind spots when it comes to oppressive systems, and we all have them. We must work on being allies when we have personal, cultural, institutional, or structural privileges, and we must be cognizant of this privilege and leverage it to make space for the voices and concerns of people who are oppressed. And finally, this work is continuous. There's no endpoint. And this is a process of learning and acting and learning again. You'll come back to the same concepts or concerns, but each time you will build on what you have done and go deeper and further in the work. It's like a spiral as opposed to a circle. In a circle, you come back to the same point, whereas in a spiral, it may feel like the same point, but it's not. It's further up on the spiral. And our commitment to this process is critical for actual change to occur. Anti-racist work is suicide prevention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Suyumoto. I'm going to ask for everyone to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box, and we're going to save them for the end, and you can address your questions to the specific panelist. And just in the interest of time, we're going to continue moving on to the other panelist. Our next panelist up is Ms. Isabel Garcia.
Hello, everyone. Wow. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your story. That's all. I'm not gonna cry and get into a speech about it, but just thank you. So my name is Isabel Garcia. I use she, her pronouns. And today I'm gonna be telling you a little bit about my story. And my story is about mostly my assimilation process and my journey in the psychiatric and mental health system. And then how in the world did I even break away from all that process or trauma, etc. And so I'm gonna start by saying that I still remember the day I said that I wanted to die for the first time. I was 13 years old in my home back in the Dominican Republic. And I had bottled up years of emptiness and anger attached to not fitting in school. I was the outcast. I was the widow in school. The pressure to be the perfect student and not being able to feel joy. I honestly wasn't able to feel joy. I remember seeing kids in birthday parties having fun, and I'm like, I wonder how that's like. I never enjoy a birthday party. I can tell you that. When I was a child, I really never did. And so when I was 13 years old, that was it. That was it. And I told my mom, I'm going to do it. I am going to do it. And of course, she freaked out. I was the perfect child. What do you mean? You want to die? What are you talking about? So she freaked out, went to this school. She went to the school to speak to my professors and the school principal. But at the end of the day, I still ended up dropping out of school. I dropped out of my freshman year in high school. Here's the deal. During this time, my mother and I visited around like 8 different mental health providers to find out what was happening to me. So we were going from one provider to the other, one provider to the other. And they all diagnosed me with major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. And so I kept trying a bunch of different medications until the opportunity of a lifetime came to us. The good old USA. We boarded the plane on April 17, 2008, one day after my 15th birthday. That was, by the way, that was the replacement of my quinceañera. The trip to the US, no, quinceañera? Why? So we are going to the USA. So here's the deal. But by then, a year had passed since I had to drop out of school and said that I wanted to die for the first time. So this trip was my chance for redemption. I was moving to the best country in the world. I was gonna go back to school. I was gonna get the best mental health treatment, right? That was the goal. We moved directly to Springfield, Massachusetts, and lived with my mom's cousin. Here's the deal. After 2-3 weeks of moving to Springfield, I ran away. I ran away to Mercy Hospital and said to the first nurse I saw, I am going to die. I am going to do it. And so I was given a bed. And that's where my journey in the psychiatric system started. Once I was given a bed, I started to interact with social workers. Now, you might think, well, duh, you were already diagnosed with depression, anxiety, you had suicidal thoughts, well, duh. Yeah, but I started to interact with social workers, not necessarily because I was suicidal, but because I was breaking the law by not attending school as a 15-year-old. Their entire focus during home visitation was, we need you to get back to school. And whatever is happening with mental health, this is just a bump in the road. You know, you have been good. You have been good all this time, and then you know this so-called outbursts happen back in your country. This is just a bump in the road. We need you to go back to school, though. But the other thing is, because I was honest with the social workers about my suicidal thoughts, I ended up being hospitalized against my will 4 times in 1 year, because they would call 911 anytime I told them I was suicidal. I had law enforcement and ambulance show up at my home all the time. It was a normal thing. And no matter how many times I begged not to go to the hospital, to please believe I was not going to do it, that I did not have a plan, it did not matter. They all said, it's for your own good. So the following became a habit. Sitting at the emergency department for hours and hours to get a bed in the hospital, while answering a risk assessment with the same questions every time. I had literally memorized all the questions by then. Then getting the bed, but waiting multiple days to then be assigned to a residential program. And I will stay in these residential programs for maybe 2-3 weeks and then I think the longest was 2 or 3 months without my consent, barely speaking English, and separated from the only thing that wasn't new in my life, which was my family. I even remember being put into solitary confinement because I tried to run away once from one of the residential programs. Now, hospitalization, involuntary hospitalization eventually stopped because one, I stopped telling the truth about my suicidality. So anytime a provider asked me, are you suicidal? I will say no, even though I was. Also, social workers stopped coming to my home once I was 16 because it was legal for me not to go to school. So by 18 though, I had decided to get my GED, go to college, work, and receive therapy. But while working and studying, I was exposed to something called race. Application forms, intake forms, they all included a race and ethnicity category. And I didn't know what race and ethnicity was. I didn't know what the difference was because I was just Dominican. That's it. I mean, you know, I ended up assuming I was Latino or Hispanic because I speak Spanish and because Caribbean, I guess it's in Latin America. Like I just assume like, but when it came to race, I chose older. I chose older because I thought I'm not white, I'm not Asian, Pacific Islander, I'm not indigenous, and I definitely, most definitely not be Black, cannot be Black. Now, this rejection of Blackness goes back to that false narrative I learned as a Dominican about Haitians being violent and dirty and stupid, which of course, again, extremely false narrative. Of course, back then I have no clue that my inclination to check other was a reflection of what we call colorism. You know, this preference for lighter skinned people and their features, which happens only within groups of color, of the same race or ethnicity. Here's the deal. I also noticed criticism from my peers about my attitude. So while working, while going to college, like for instance, but I also remember in the past, residential staff would criticize me for being rude and loud or talking too fast when I was just being myself. But those comments kept going while I was in college and while I was working and while I was volunteering. There was also a lot of comments making fun of my accent. Comments like, I thought you were dumb, but you're actually smart. Have you thought about getting rid of your accent so people know that you're actually smart? Or you have been here for 10 years and your English still sucks? I don't understand anything you're saying. Please go back to your country, learn English, and come back again, and then talk to me. Of course, back then, I didn't know that these subtle and hostile messages were called microaggressions. Because of these microaggressions, I decided to do a lot of things. I stopped watching media in Spanish. I stopped speaking Spanish in public. I decided to only surround myself with white people, only white people. I decided to get rid of my accent with YouTube videos. I decided to tone down my body language and lower my voice tone. So I will practice in the mirror before going out anywhere. I was also very close to changing the spelling of my name from Isabel with a Y to Isabel with an I during my US citizenship process, because I wanted to make it easier for white people to pronounce my name. All of these are aspects of internalized oppression. And, you know, that's a belief among systematically oppressed people that negative stereotypes about them are true. So I believed it all and decided that I had to change. Internalized oppression led me to believe that assimilating, so replacing my original culture with the white dominant culture, was the answer to my problems. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so you said you were going to therapy, right? So what happened? Nothing happened. Well, first, because I was already depressed, anxious, and suicidal when coming to this country, I always say that a heads up during my inpatient treatment and residential programs about how I could experience any of these issues as a first generation, low income Dominican immigrant with English as a second language would have been really nice. It would have been super nice to have a heads up, but I didn't have a heads up. It also would have been nice to have these issues addressed when they actually came up during the 8 years of outpatient therapy I received after leaving the residential programs behind. Unfortunately, didn't happen because my former therapists, they focus on controlling my responses to my oppressive environment. So any feeling that I had was my fault, and I needed to take responsibility for eliminating them. And what I mean by that is, for instance, my anger was never labeled as a response to microaggressions, but as a low self-esteem or a lack of anger management. Or like my need to socialize with only white people was seen as a preference and not as an anti-Black and colorist behavior. And so because my loss of esteem and inadequate social skills were considered the root cause of my distress, stabilizing my mood and reframing my thoughts became the goal for them. But that wasn't what I needed. That wasn't what I needed, or till this day, what I don't need to deal with my response to an oppressive environment, because now I know that it wasn't my fault. Now, I swear there's good news. There's good news though. I swear. 3 years ago, I decided to go on vacation to the Dominican Republic after 10 years of not visiting, because remember, I didn't want to be Dominican, so I refused. But 3 years ago, I did go because, well, I got my bachelor's degree and I thought, whatever. It was the perfect opportunity to redeem myself and tell the success immigrant story, right? That proof of assimilation was like a stamp. But as soon as I stepped out of the plane, I knew, oh no, I knew this is where I belong. Feeling the heat on my skin, looking at the people, walking down the streets, visiting the house I used to live in, eating the food I used to eat, going to the beach, seeing the buildings, smelling the stores, feeling the melanin coming back to my skin. I felt my spirit coming back to my body. And so, when I returned to the US, I started listening to Spanish music again. I looked for Dominican and Spanish-speaking TV shows. I began to seek friendships with people of color, especially women of color. So I joined a group called And Still We Rise. I started to speak Spanish unapologetically and let my body language and loudness take space wherever I went. I decided to stick with my accent and correct people when they mispronounce my name. And I started to find beauty in Blackness and defy my own and my family's colorist beliefs. My liberation had just begun. And little did I know, now I have my own organization talking about my story, training all these providers, therapists, talking to the community. And so, well, I think that's a good ending. Pretty good ending, right? I think so. So I'm gonna leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabel, for your very inspiring story. And as someone has said in the chat, for your journey. It is definitely a journey that is very inspiring. Thank you so much. We are going to move on. And as I said earlier, please put your questions for Isabel in the chat, and we will get to them at the end for all of our panelists. And now we will move on to our final panelist, Shilpa Tirukovalar. Kovalur. I apologize if I am not saying your name correctly. I am trying, but I think I am not getting it. So please correct me. And look forward to hearing your story, Shilpa. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, Wahida. And you got it right the second time, so you're good.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm also so honored to share this panel with Pata and Isabel. I'm so inspired hearing your story, so just want to give you some props as well. So hi everyone, again, I'm Shilpa. I'm 24 and I live in Waltham, Mass, and I have a cat named Marlo. As Wahida said, I graduated from UMass Boston in 2019. I've been interested in mental health and social justice for a long time, so I decided to do a double major in psychology and women's and gender studies. Now I'm a senior peer coordinator for the NAN project, doing work I value in the youth suicide prevention field. And I really appreciate this opportunity to share my story with you all today. I'm a first generation South Asian American. I grew up in a tight-knit Indian community in Oregon, where I was surrounded by people who shared a similar cultural background. Through get-togethers and celebrations, I felt connected to a community that was looking out for me. I also had a great group of friends who I felt comfortable talking about everything. All of these supports made coping with my home life much easier. My parents were in an unhealthy marriage, and my daily life involved hours of screaming, arguments, and violence. Even though I was being hurt by the fighting, my parents said it was normal and made me believe that yelling was a healthy way to express emotions and solve conflicts. My mom also used these conflicts to turn me against my dad, and because of this, I felt guilty talking to him, and I ended up distancing myself. In 6th grade, I started having trouble getting out of bed on time, procrastinating more on assignments, and feeling generally unmotivated, especially keeping up with extracurricular activities like swimming, taekwondo, and dance. I actually ended up dropping swimming and taekwondo, which I loved. I had difficulty explaining to my friends and parents why I lost interest, since I wasn't even sure why myself. I now know that these were signs of depression, and I would have greatly benefited from getting some support for my mental health at this time. My life changed in a major way in 8th grade when we moved to Massachusetts. I was so sad to leave my community behind, and adjusting to a new school and home was difficult. I tried to continue to talk to my friends, but over time, the texts and phone calls dwindled. Not having them around made me miserable, and everything else became harder to handle. I would stress about all my responsibilities, like the homework assignments I needed to finish and chores that were piling up, but it was tough to find the energy to do anything about them. I tried talking to my mom, but she didn't really understand depression or mental health challenges. She thought I was being influenced by American culture and said to try to be as happy as possible around other people because she didn't want my struggles to reflect badly on the family. I didn't really agree with her, but I also didn't have anyone else in my life I felt I could go to, so I kept things to myself. My junior year of high school was one of my lowest points. I spent every spare hour in bed and I was avoiding everyone. My procrastination had turned into completely missing assignments, and as a result, my grades, which had been decent, were all pretty much D's across the board. And since I felt a lot of shame about this, I also made up excuses to stay home from school. I started to neglect my basic self-care, like showering and brushing my teeth, and spent hours on the internet locked in my room every day to escape. When teachers tried to ask if I was okay, I shut down and wouldn't talk to them because I felt so much shame. I just had this gut feeling that even though I was struggling, I didn't deserve help and I should be able to figure this out on my own. At this point, speaking to a guidance counselor was unthinkable because the thought that yet another adult would be disappointed in me was too overwhelming. At the same time, my parents were going through a very messy divorce. The fighting got intense, and my sister and I were caught in the middle. Even though I was glad that my parents finally separated, getting used to moving between two houses every week was really stressful. I was really uncomfortable about everything changing so fast, and this made my depression even worse. But after a few months, I found that my dad and I slowly started to get to know each other better without the influence of my mom. We bonded over learning to cook and would Skype with my grandmother, who would teach us different recipes. I found that if we were focused on a task like chopping vegetables, it was easier for us to talk about difficult things. I began to confide in my dad. He knew my grades had dropped and sensed something was off, but because he was so distracted from the divorce, he didn't realize how badly I was doing. Having these conversations were hard and they felt really scary at first. But after I realized that my dad wasn't judging me for struggling, I started to open up more. I learned that my dad had experienced similar challenges himself and had found therapy really useful. This surprised me as I had no idea he had struggled or even received treatment. Because of the stigma around mental health and how distant we were, he hadn't told me any of this in the past. After hearing his experiences, I decided to give therapy a try. My first therapist helped me develop a number of self-care activities to manage stress and regulate my emotions, like writing down my thoughts in a journal, taking a walk, or calling a friend when I'm feeling sad. It also helped me develop a different perspective of what a healthy home life is supposed to look like. This experience of being validated and having an adult try to understand me was so helpful. But even though I had a great experience with this therapist, I decided not to see her after I started college and try to find one closer to my campus. College became an opportunity to reconnect with my South Asian heritage after being isolated since my move to Massachusetts. In this process of reconnecting, I also started to unpack the effects of cultural and intergenerational trauma. Instead of viewing my mental health struggles as a personal failing, I started to see how my upbringing, my culture, and how I navigated the world directly impacted my mental health. It became very important to me to have a therapist that understood this and didn't treat my identity as irrelevant. Just practicing coping skills wasn't enough. I needed help to process all of these aspects of myself. And it honestly took me a few years of meeting with different therapists on and off until I met my current therapist, who was wonderful. But unfortunately, I had some pretty off-putting experiences during this process. I had therapists make assumptions about my life, expecting that I was going to be forced into an arranged marriage, or asking me if I liked Deepak Chopra within minutes of meeting me. When I spoke to one therapist about my relationship with my mom, they recommended cutting her off instead of helping me learn how to set boundaries and communicate better. I understand that cutting people off can be the best thing to do in certain situations, but it was not an option for me, especially with my own mom. It was frustrating to try to build a therapeutic relationship and be hit with microaggressions or feel like I wasn't being listened to. Meeting my current therapist was like a breath of fresh air. She listens to me and treats me like a whole person rather than a stereotype or a list of symptoms. She's also a woman of color, and though I feel more comfortable with her than my previous therapists who are white, she never assumes things and treats me like the expert of my own experiences. By working with my therapist, I've learned and internalized that prioritizing my mental health is not a rejection of my family, culture, or community. Everyone deserves help and healing. And this understanding is what informs my work with the NAN project. A huge part of my work involves sharing my story with high schoolers. When my fellow peer mentors and I present our stories called comeback stories, we show these young adults that they don't have to hide their mental health struggles and they deserve recovery. There have been many instances in the past year where guidance counselors let us know that a student who was not on their radar at all visited them right after our presentation to seek help. I've had students come up to me after presenting and let me know that they really resonated with my story, that it gave them some hope that things could get better, or that they were in a similar situation and already were getting the support they needed. These experiences make me so grateful that I can play a small role in breaking down the stigma around mental health. And personally, I've been able to build a life that allows me to take care of myself on my terms. Being a child of immigrants can sometimes feel like I need to choose between myself and my family, and it's a lot of pressure. Though I wish I could have received support earlier, I understand that it's never too late to start the healing process. Having a support system of friends, family, and my therapist has made it easier not to isolate or use unhealthy coping skills, especially during the pandemic. Game nights with my friends make me really happy, and so does taking care of my cat and spending time with my little sibling and my dad, who is still very supportive. My mom and I have a much better relationship as well. Things aren't perfect, but by setting up boundaries, adjusting what I can expect from her, and communicating how I need to be treated has vastly improved things. Even though I still struggle sometimes, I know that I will never reach that low point again. I now understand that everyone deserves to be listened to and understood. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I need to take a moment to take in all of these three presentations from all three of you. I just want to extend my gratitude again, and give all three of you a moment to, I hope you are reading and following the chat and taking in all the gratitude that is coming in for all three of you and your really incredible stories. So I will get to the questions in just a moment, but I have been taking my own notes. I wanted to reflect just my thoughts on all three of your stories and presentations. And I'm cheating a little bit because this is my second time meeting all of you. So I'm, especially honored to be sitting here today because I get all three of you for the second time today. And what was striking to me the first time that I met all of you, and I was not involved in picking you. So when I met you for the first time and listened to a synopsis of all three of your stories, this is the first time I'm listening to your full story, was sort of the arc of all three of your stories and the backdrop of it. And as I said, I was not involved in the planning of the conference, or at least the clinical side of it. And I was just sort of really taken aback by how, and I think your line, Pata, really sort of summarizes it. And it's a line from your poem that, says, perhaps your despair is not an illness. And perhaps, and I know mental, I'm going to say diagnoses are a thing, and I know that, and I'm mental health clinician, and I recognize all of that. But perhaps for all three of you, there's something else, and all of you acknowledge that. Isabel, you said the assimilation process for you. Shilpa, you said, it was for me, it was most striking that for you, perhaps it was shocking to me that for you, your microaggressions came from a therapist, which is sort of, for so many of us that, we say, well, just get to a therapist, Like, we encourage so many people who are really struggling to just get to a therapist. And when they finally do, and you're sitting in that chair, and we know how hard that process is, and to hear some of those things coming out of a therapist's mouth, it's like shocking, right? And those microaggressions coming out of a therapist's mouth. And someone really wise once said to me, like, I don't know, those don't seem very micro to me. So we label them microaggressions, but they don't land micro. They don't land and fall on in our bodies and our souls as microaggressions, right? They feel pretty heavy when they actually land. And Isabel, when you were talking, you said that when you expressed your anger, it was never seen as an appropriate response to the microaggressions. It was always reframed, and I love us as therapists, we love to like reframe things and all of that. and it was always reframed as different things, and maybe it was your self-esteem, and maybe it was this, but never as a, perhaps this is an appropriate response to what is happening to you, and the microaggressions that are happening to you. So as all of you were telling your stories, I am sort of, yes, there's the mental health, and I absolutely want to acknowledge that, Isabel, you already came to this country with, you already had some struggles, and Pata, you acknowledge that there's absolutely, mental illness in the family, and Shilpa, you had family dynamics, and absolutely, but there's none of this happens in a vacuum, and definitely want to acknowledge that piece of it. So again, I do want to thank you for sharing your stories, and for putting all of these struggles in the context, and for saying that none of this happens in that vacuum. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the contextual issues in which we come, and the layers of all of this. So I'm going to go ahead and start asking some of the questions that were asked. Pata, this is specifically addressed to you. And the question is, as a professional who combats their own diagnoses, how do you manage your own symptoms while supporting others?
This is a really interesting question to me, because I think that there are a lot of us who work in this field in some manner, and I'm not a clinician, so I'm an educator, but I'm starting a National Asian American Pacific Islander Empowerment Network of lived experience people, and one of the special interest groups will be professionals, because it's such an important question. I feel like one thing that's really important is being able to really know yourself, to know when you can extend and when you can't, when you have to pull back, and when you can push through. Because there are times I push through, but there are other times that I know that it's not good for me to push through. And I think when I was first struggling a lot in my 30s, and was still working, full time at a university, high pressure, assistant professor, all this stuff, that it was really hard, because I kept pushing through and pushing through and pushing through and pushing through, until finally the bottom fell out. It just fell out, and I had to regroup and really build up again. So I think one of the things is really knowing yourself. The other thing is, I think, really that what Isabel was talking about, the self-care, the soul care, self-care, community care, being able to understand that, you have to, and, Shilpa too, you have to take care of yourself. You can't, and you have to take care of your community and where you live, and that you can't support others if you are not okay. If you are not okay, at least in some ways. I mean, I don't feel I'm ever really 100% okay. You know what I mean? So, and I think, I although it was addressed to me, I do think that Shilpa and Isabel might have something to say about this. So I'm just going to pass it on to them.
Yeah, thank you so much. Isabel, Shilpa? Anything you
I
would
think
add?
Pata answered that beautifully. So yeah.
All right, thank you. So this next question is for all the panelists, and the participant asked, they said that I have a parent of Asian descent who has suffered from undiagnosed mental illnesses since their childhood, and they choose not to seek treatment. How can family respect their loved ones' decisions for not seeking treatment and support them, but also how can you continue watching them suffer without treatment? This is open to all panelists, whoever wants to.
I can start us off. Well, first, thank you for sharing that. That's a tough position to be in. I definitely can relate to the experience of like feeling like you've kind of emotionally outgrown your parents, or you're making choices that are a lot different than theirs, and kind of seeing that they're suffering, but again, understanding that they're an adult and they're the ones who need to make decisions for themselves. you know, I would say, like, of course, you know, take care and support your father to the extent that you feel comfortable, because of course, like, your well-being is really important, and you don't want to compromise your, like, self-care, soul care, or whatever that term is, in order to kind of like put yourself out there for someone who may not be ready to move on and to, you know, start the healing process. So I would say, like, keep like being there and being persistent, with the understanding that, like, if he wants to seek that treatment or if he wants to change, like, it really does have to come from him, which can be frustrating.
Thank you.
I could add to that. My mother, who was in treatment but was very reluctant to get it. So I can relate to this, you know, situation, and where you might say, "Gee, I think that you might need to get some help," and the person saying, "No, I'm not going to do that." So, um, you know, I agree totally with what, you know, what Shilpa was saying in terms of being able to really pay attention to what your boundaries are, what you can do. Because I know sometimes when my mother was having a bipolar episode, it was very hard because she would say things that were that were psychotic, you know. And so how do you deal with that when you're trying, you can't reason, you know, so you have to know what your reaction is going to be and what you can do for yourself and for the situation. And sometimes the decisions are very, very hard. My mother was in an apartment building, and I was in an apartment down, you know, a couple of doors down, and the neighbors called me because she was, you know, making lots of noise and da, da, da. And finally I had to say, you need to call the police. There's nothing I can do. I mean, I would call her, I'd say, you did, I mean, and it was really heartbreaking to me, but I literally couldn't do anything. I literally couldn't do anything, and it was awful. But, and, you know, I mean, anyway, so I just think that you have to really take care of yourself. You have to understand what your parameters are, and you have to be compassionate to the person who's struggling. So.
Such difficult questions. Thank you for answering. We have another question here. It's a little bit long because it's descriptive. Someone has asked, something that's always been hard for me is the phrase, "It gets better." So for those of you familiar with the suicide prevention strategy in Massachusetts, I think it's a nationwide campaign, is the "It Gets Better" campaign. When I was at the peak of my suicide battle, suicide ideation battle, I got tired of hearing people tell me that it would get better when I could not see past tomorrow. Today, I struggle to use this line when thinking with clients, especially the ones who are living with trauma, because I actually can't promise that their circumstances will improve to a degree that makes an impact. Are there any recommendations for how to better instill a sense of hope in people who are deeply depressed because of outside influences and or are having trouble believing that things will or can actually get better? So that's open to anyone.
So the question is so interesting to me. How to better instill a sense of hope in people? So it seems like correct me if I'm wrong, you're putting the responsibility on yourself to give that hope to like kind of give hope to this person.
It seems like this person is a clinician now working with clients.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so why is that? Why is that your responsibility? And who says that that is your responsibility too? And that's one of my things, that there is a sense of ownership, even in the things that are supposedly good, like hope. I mean, if you think about it, in the therapeutic relationship or process, whatever it is that you're building, well, wouldn't it automatically, supposedly, quote unquote, instill hope? Does that make sense? Like, do you feel you have to actually say it, like it gets better? Or do you think that the process itself can create that, can create that sense of it gets better, quote unquote, it gets better.
Okay.
Like, I don't know. I think that when I see myself, and I'm not a clinician, I consider myself a peer supporter. I don't see myself with that responsibility because there's a sense of mutuality. So I will actually ask the person, I don't know how you will call it, the client, the person seeking support, what is even hope to them? Like, what does that even mean to them? Right? So going back to them and reaching for that mutuality. I don't know if that makes sense. But I think that's a lot of pressure and responsibility to be like, how can I, create these, I don't know. I don't think, I wouldn't want that pressure. That's all I'm saying.
I also think that, connections, it's like the things that I think give me hope is connecting with other people who have gone through something similar. So I think creating peer connections, I mean, I understand what you're saying, Isabel. I think it's an interesting question of where does that responsibility lie? But it's also important to think, like, for me, like when I was first struggling, seeing panels like this was actually give me hope, because it made me say, I'm not alone. There are people out there connecting with other people that are, have been struggling, have gone through similar things, and who have come to a different place. I found that hopeful myself.
Okay, that's helpful too. Thank you. So I'm sort of seeing I'm sort of looking at time and seeing 2 or 3 questions here too that I think might be. I love the back and forth in the chat as well. So thank you for using that feature as well to continue conversations with the question. So a question I have here is that Shilpa describes her clinician as someone who, quote, treated her like the expert of her own experiences. So Shilpa, you said at some point that your clinician finally treated you like the expert, right? That was the one that that finally got at least some of it right, or better. Can you describe more how your clinician went on to create that space? And then, for Isabel, you and Pata, you as well, can you describe positive and or negative experiences with treatment? And I think that also sort of ties in with, what the clinicians in this space are really looking for is this question of what can be the biggest takeaway messages for the mental health professionals in the audience today. Like, how do we create, because we've heard some, from all of you, some not so great experiences you've had with mental health experiences, professionals, spaces. So what can we do better? How can we create spaces that would invite you to tell the truth, to want to connect? Because Isabel, I remember you saying that what you learned was how to lie, right? How to continue to lie. And you memorize the questions, and you got thrown into solitary confinement and all of those things and all these microaggressions. So what would be the opposite of that? How do we create spaces where you would want to tell the truth, where you would want to stay, where you would want to, even if the clinician, Victor said this in one of his talks earlier, it would be great if the clinician could look like you and give you, like you would say a word or a very sort of idiosyncratic thing about your culture, and immediately the clinician would know what you're talking about. But, unfortunately, we don't live in that world. So until we get there, how can we make it better for you? For the clinicians in the audience, for the mental health counselors in the audience.
Oh, Isabel, you can go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, that's my I guess that's the question that I keep trying to answer with all of my trainings and stuff, right? It's not the provider's fault. It's not the therapist's fault. It's not the social worker's fault. All the things that happened to me, it wasn't their fault. It was the mental health system, the social work system, the psychiatric system's fault, because they are the ones that encourage certain things. So like liability, for instance. What do you do when you say someone's suicide? Losing your license. That, come on, yo. Like, of course, if I work hard for a license, I'm gonna be scared of losing that life. Hello. So it's not the social worker. I'm not. I'm not using an individualistic approach for this. I'm using the systemic approach, and so I focus on. So what has to change? How can we do the contrary? That's policy change. That's looking at that liability in mental health, looking at that policy, looking at that law, and how people with suicidal thoughts like mine, which are chronic, how we're treated because of that liability, because of the influence of that liability policy. So it's looking more at, I will say, the justice level of things. It's also looking at graduate schools. What are providers being taught in graduate school, and how are they being taught certain things? Is lived experience in the curriculum? Is suicide prevention even a thing in curriculums? But suicide prevention with a social justice focus, right? That's my thing. Is that a thing in graduate schools? So when providers are coming out doing their internships or whatever, do they even know what assimilation is? Do they even know what microaggression is? Do they even know what internalized oppression is? So again, it's not, to me, it's not so much about the provider themselves. It's more about what is the system doing to give them the tools they need to actually do less harm or no harm at all. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense to me. Because even if individuals get it right, there's still an entire system to contend with. Yep. I appreciate those comments. Shilpa, I think, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer that initial question. It was like a three-part complex, awesome question. So yeah, like the expert of your own experiences thing. So I think this is also related to like everything that we talked about, but there's this concept of like cultural humility versus cultural competence. So the cultural competence is that like you like try to educate yourself and learn about other cultures and how like certain, you know, specific people, like people of color, like LGBTQ plus folks have different experiences like related to mental health, and that's good. And I think everyone should strive for that. But cultural humility is that like you will never be able to understand someone's experiences, even if you've like done tons of research and like devoted so much time to like educating yourself, right? Because like someone could learn a lot about South Asian culture and mental health, like Asian Americans, but like you will never know my Shilpa's experience. And so that's what it means of like treating myself as the expert. Like only I know what I've been through and what my story and my life is. And you as a clinician can support me and kind of like make observations and help me get there. But like, you can't tell me what I'm about or like tell me what my experiences are. So that's kind of what that means. Even if I have another South Asian therapist, they don't have the exact experience that I've had because my race isn't my entire life or my entire identity. So that's kind of what that means. So I think just like person-centered, like trying to really understand where your client is about and their life as an individual, with the understanding that like their race and all these other factors can affect that, but you will never truly get it. So that's what that means.
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, I really thank you, Isabel, for the systems perspective. because I think it's really, really important to think about, what constraints clinicians have and what education they're getting and all that kind of thing. I also think fee for service is another way that we create a lot of issues around clinicians. But in terms of individual therapists, I have a therapist who I've been seeing for many years, and it's very surprising to me because he's white and he's male, which was like, whoa, how is that possible? Anyway, but he is really, he's a family therapist, but he's very keen on collaboration, like, the fact that we're in a collaborative relationship and it's not just, and so someone asked a question about my treatment plan thing, and somewhere in there, and it's not just that. I mean, he's very much a part of that, like, you have to define what is going to heal you. You cannot, I'm not going to tell you what's going to heal you. And the cultural humility, I mean, that's really important, I think. And just being, coming in with an inquiry stance, like, I don't like assuming you don't know as opposed to assuming you do know. I think that's really important for clinicians. And something like radical acceptance. I mean, I really felt really accepted by my therapist, and I felt like he, even when I was self-injuring, he was not one of these people that was going to, say, well, I'm not going to see you, or I'm not going to, like, he was very much, this is a coping mechanism that is not working anymore because it wasn't working. So, how can we shape this to be something different? But it was a collaborative process. It wasn't like, you're wrong, I'm right. So, I mean, I think those kinds of things are really important for individual therapists as we try to work on some of the systemic, issues as well.
Such good points. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm glad you got to the treatment plan question too, because there was lots of interest around that treatment plan that you flashed up for just a second, and I was like, oh, I wish I took a picture of that, and then it was gone. So maybe at some point you can share that as well, Pata. I have because I believe it was you, Shilpa, but I do think all three of you addressed this. Sorry, not you, Shilpa. I think it was you, Isabel, that mentioned this sort of specifically with words, although all three of you sort of, address the concept of this, but this idea of this work having a very real piece of social activism to it. And you said it again, more recently, Isabel, this idea of, doing suicide prevention work as social activism with the social justice lens. And I, very recently read somewhere that, providing healthcare is suicide prevention, and making sure people are housed and fed and have mental health services. All of those things are absolutely suicide prevention. So with that sort of with that in mind and with that lens on, I would like to ask the question of how, and all of you, by virtue of being here and the virtue of the stories that you have told here today and the way in which you have all given your presentations, I would like to ask the question of, and I'm not sure if this will be the last question, but if it's not, I have other questions, of how can we all, those of us who are in the audience today, how can we all be advocates like you? How do we do this work with that social justice lens? How do we do this work through the eyes of activism? The work being suicide prevention work. And specifically, if we are thinking of carrying this work into the future, suicide prevention work into the future, and the future of suicide prevention, how do you see us carrying this into the future, perhaps with the social justice lens?
Those are two big questions. So for the first question, I will say education. And I think education is is key. But the question is, from who? From who are you getting this education? Because there are many suicide prevention trainings out there, mental health trainings out there. There are a lot of them. But I will say, be very critical of the information that you're getting. So for instance, there are many organizations like mine, like Estoy Aquí, that are grassroots, are peer support led, and they do everything with a social justice focus. And they offer trainings to organizations, right? So looking at that, maybe you are not the director or the supervisor of a department, but you can be like, oh my God, look, this is a training that, let's say I have a training called Suicide Prevention from a Racial Justice Lens. Oh my God, look, let me send this description or training guide or whatever to my director and say, hey, can we bring this to these to our workplace, to the employees? I mean, I think bringing that type of training and education is key. Is key, point blank. But for your second question, how do we move like suicide prevent? Like how do we move suicide prevent, or how does it look like? So suicide prevention with a social justice focus, like how does that look like?
Or going forward, hope for the future.
I could spend hours talking about that, hours, because that's literally my entire work. But I will say, being aware of those social, cultural, political factors that affect mental health. I cannot speak about mental health without talking about oppression. It's impossible for me to do that. And so if you are doing that, you might want to think, hey, wait a second, I don't talk about oppression when I talk about mental health. Maybe I should do some little reading somewhere, because I'm telling you, for me, it's just impossible. So remember when I was talking about how the goal became, what was it? Emotional regulation and thought reframing. So I'm not saying that that's bad, by the way. I'm saying that that's bad. I'm saying that let's look deeper. So I think moving forward, let's dig deeper. Let's dig way deeper, and let's really ask, what is the root cause? What is the actual problem here? Who really is responsible for this feeling or emotion? Isn't the client that I'm looking at right now, or is it capitalism? Or is it freaking, I don't know, the pandemic? I think that just starting to ask those questions, like, what is this really about? Like, what is truly killing people? Like, let's talk, that I think starting with those questions and then digging deeper and looking for that training, that education from grassroots, peer support led folks, I think that's a start. But I could speak about this forever, so I'm gonna shut up now.
I could listen to you forever, Isabel. So one of the things I think it's really important is that when we address these issues, that it has to be done on all levels, that it's not just, we can't just address it at the individual level, because we just address it at the individual level, it's just going on all around us, and it actually doesn't make a full impact either. We have to do individual, cultural, institutional, and systemic levels. It has to happen all at the same time. And we have to realize, I think too, that, like I said before, anti-racism is mental health and is suicide prevention. So what does that mean? What does that really mean? And it means that we have to be in a place where we are interrogating ourselves, our practice, our systems, our institutions constantly, and then trying to figure out what we can do to ameliorate what we see. Because if you start digging, as Isabel said, digging, you're going to get mud, and the mud is not necessarily pretty. So we need to figure out how to address all of that. The other thing is, like I mentioned before, I'm co-author of the Racial Equity Toolkit, and Isabel actually worked on that because we ran a lot of our stuff through the Alliance for Equity, and she's part of our alliance. Which, and if anyone wants to join the MCSP Alliance for Equity, please, I'll put my email in the chat. We have a White Ally Caucus and a People of Color Caucus, and we do work together a lot, and sometimes we do it separately. And so in addition, and we have this toolkit, which I'll also put in the chat again, which talks about a lot of foundational concepts as well as ways to move forward. So, I mean, I think, as a field, we have to be thinking about how to incorporate these issues in all the levels. So, thanks.
Yeah, I agree with both of you in terms of addressing these on multiple levels. Speaking specifically to like my work with the NAN project, we do, we kind of address the stigma around suicide. So the way that we kind of approach it through this organization is that, people need to get comfortable asking about suicide. If you're worried that someone might be having, suicidal thoughts, or that they might be in danger, is like asking them and saying that word and like putting it on the table. And then not from like a clinical perspective, but we also kind of talk to students and teachers and basically say, like, if you're worried about someone, like, go talk to them, because there's no guarantee that they will seek help for themselves. So that's kind of our, approach to suicide prevention, of like that connection and how you can help folks get the help that they need, and that you kind of have to reach out and do that.
Okay, thank you so much. So we have just a very, very short amount of time. So in, 30 seconds or less. So just very, very quickly, if you had, something you could tell yourself, your younger self, some words of hope or wisdom you could give yourselves looking back. Some of you are, like me, a little bit further away from your younger self. Some of you are a little bit closer to your younger selves. What would those words of hope and wisdom be to your younger selves? I know it's a hard one, because I'm still looking for that wisdom. I know.
I'll start. I'm far away from my younger self, like way far away. But anyway, so I think I would want to tell, particularly my suicidal teenage self, that you are enough, and that you are strong, and you have and yeah, and then just that you are enough, that you will, you don't have to be anything. You don't have to be a doctor, or, a lawyer, or engineer, all the expectations of Asian families or model minority or any of that, that you're actually okay just as you are. And, and you can experience your life just as you are. And, just really to focus on that and be present, and not, worry about all of the pressures and expectations.
Thank you.
I also was going to say you are enough, but an additional thing that I was going to say is that, like, you deserve better, because I think that's like a big thing I struggle with, but I don't feel like I deserve better for myself or for people to listen to me. So yeah, you deserve better.
I will say for me, for my teenage self in the US, it's not your fault. It wasn't your fault. Your response was a natural response to injustice and oppression. It had nothing to do with you.
Thank you. So I want to take the last few seconds to thank all three of you, Shilpa, Isabel, Pata, all three of you. Thank you so much. I think this is not an easy endeavor to share your stories. I know all three of you sit at the intersection of many, many, many identities. So for all of those different selves that you brought here, and shared with us here today. I really deeply personally thank you. I know, and again, just take a moment to read the chat. I know so many people are so deeply moved by your stories of struggle, but the hope too, and the fact that you are here to share your stories and share the hope with us, and then share your wisdom with us. I know that sometimes we don't quite feel the wisdom, but it comes through. So I want to share you. I want to thank you for that, and just I hope you feel the gratitude coming to you from all of us through our screens. So thank you.